All right, we're going to bring in our friend for this next segment. You all know who she is. Ellin Jimmerson. Ellin, thanks for joining.
Well, thank you for letting me join.
Of course. Yeah, I wish we were talking under happier circumstances because this next segment is quite heavy. But you brought this to my attention a few weeks back, and I promised you we would cover it at one point. I wanted to take the time to research it a bit before we did, but this, of course, refers to the horrific death of Tony Mitchell in an Alabama jail, a man who was brought into custody and later died of hypothermia despite being in custody at an Alabama jailhouse. So do you want to set up who Tony was, how he was apprehended, his treatment at the jail, and what's going on now?
Sure.
And just, by the way, part of the reason you're as interested in the story as you are is because you live in the state of Alabama yourself.
I live in the state of Alabama myself, and I've also had, there was a high-speed police chase, which contributed to the death of my daughter and her boyfriend. So, I've got a dog in the fight.
Right.
So Tony Mitchell showed up at the home of his cousin on January the 12th, I believe it was, this past January 12th. And he was, it had been only 3 months since his cousin had seen him, but when Tony arrived, he didn't recognize him. He had lost 100 pounds between the funeral of his father and the day that he showed up at his cousin's house. He had a history of drug abuse. He had gotten into methamphetamines. He also, so he was down 100 pounds. He was drug addicted, and he also was very obviously mentally ill. He, once his cousin recognized who he was, to try to make a long story short, he began to tell his cousin that he was concerned about the body of a brother of his who had died stillborn years and years ago. And he wanted to get up into the attic of the family home so they could find the baby's body. And he said inside the attic, there were 2 portals. One went to heaven and one went to hell. And he was wanting to get the baby into heaven. And so his cousin, understood that this was a serious psychotic situation he was in. So he called the sheriff's office to get a wellness check. No one picked up, but the call went over to 911, and they asked him, "Do you want to send us to send an ambulance out?" And he said, "Yes, I think that would be a good idea." But before the ambulance got there, the sheriffs got there, and it was the sheriff himself and his public relations officer, and I think a couple other officers. They got there and they alleged that Tony fired a shot at them, which is not clear whether that actually happened. But then he disappeared into the woods behind their house. So they went into the woods. They were able to apprehend him, capture him, and arrest him and take him into custody. When he came out of the woods, his face was black. His face had been clean as much as it could be when the sheriffs got there, and he ran into the woods. When he came out of the woods, his face was black. His cousin goes over to the sheriff and says, they put him in the car. Why is his face black? And the sheriff said, he apparently spray painted his face black in the, seconds or minutes that he was in the woods, because he wanted to he was preparing to go into the portal to hell. There has been quite a bit of discussion about that on the Justice for Tony Mitchell Facebook group. And they say they don't believe that he spray painted his face black. They believe that the sheriff set off some kind of a flare, which placed, residue, black residue on his face. I suppose that's neither here nor there. But what is important, I think, is that, and sort of reflective of the sheriff's office, is that bringing him out of the woods with his face black, they apparently thought was quite funny. And they, even before I think they got Tony to the Walker County jail, they took a picture of him and put it up on their Facebook page.
Let me just stop you 1 second, because I just want to illustrate this for people. So this is Tony in his natural healthy state. He's about 6'3", 6'4", weighed about 230. So that's him in his healthy state. And then this is the picture that you were talking to me about, that you sent me right before we came on. This is the state in which they apprehended this guy. So here he is, and then here he is when they get him. Wow.
And they saw fit to put that picture up on their Facebook page.
Yep. All right, so they get him into the jail. What happens then?
They get him into the jail, and they left him in the booking cell, which is not intended to keep people long term. They said that they were putting him on a suicide watch, and that being their rationale for taking all his clothes from him. So he was left naked, malnourished, obviously in a psychotic state, in that cell for 2 weeks. He didn't have a cot. He didn't have a blanket. He didn't have a toilet for 2 weeks.
And no clothes for 2 weeks.
And no clothes for 2 weeks. Nothing to sleep on but the cold concrete floor.
And by the way, what you're saying is available. There's a primary source for this, which is the lawsuit, which is a public document now, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Which I read through myself.
I've got it on my Facebook page, and I've got it on my YouTube channel. So about the third day, for reasons that no one has put forth, one of the officers decided to tase him. When they tased him, because of his methamphetamine abuse, his teeth had rotted out. So he used false teeth to chew solid food. Those teeth popped out when he was tased. That was 3 days into a 2-week stay. They never gave him his false teeth back. So on top of everything, they put it in a bag, and on top of everything else, then he couldn't even eat solid food. He was photographed. The security camera footage shows him being taken into the showers and then dragged from the showers, and then dragged back to his cell. At some point, the family alleges that they put Tony in the kitchen's walk-in refrigerator and left him there naked, strapped to a chair for 3 hours. Then they took him out and took him back to his cell, where he stayed for another 5 hours, at which point they decided that he was dying and they wanted to get him to a hospital. They didn't show any urgency whatsoever. They did not call an ambulance. They've got video of them lifting him up. And another thing that happened that delayed him getting to the hospital, once they had made the decision to get him there, and they were just going to put him into the sheriff's SUV.
Yeah, here's a picture of that, by the way.
Yeah.
It's them loading him in to get him into the hospital.
Yeah. And you can, you can see his legs are shackled. Maybe you can see it.
Yeah, you can see it there.
But his hands are not.
Right.
So they had brought another woman in to book her for some offense. And apparently they didn't want the woman to see her. So they dragged him back to his cell until she was booked, or they dragged him somewhere. Anyway, trying to make a really long story a little bit shorter. When he arrived at the jail, at that point, there's a name for it, which any of the nurses or doctors in the chat would know, where as you're dying, you only breathe like 2 to 4 times a minute. And he was 8 something breathing. He gets there, he's barely breathing. They begin to try to resuscitate him, and then they are told that he had been in a freezer. At that point, the doctor took his temperature rectally, and it was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees centigrade. And so the question before the doctor, they tried to resuscitate him. They changed their protocol, what they were going to do to try to save his life. And they needed to know about the hypothermia. And upon his death, the doctor said he had in fact died of hypothermia. And he said, I failed to see how anybody in police custody could have a rectal temperature of 72 degrees.
Right.
Right.
And so now they are filing a lawsuit, obviously, against the sheriff.
Family, yeah. It's technically the family, the estate, and they have filed suit. The sheriff has filed basically a rebuttal. And one of the things in their rebuttal was that they questioned whether the doctor knew how to take a rectal temperature, which any of us who have ever had kids, we know how to take a rectal temperature. If that's the best they got. And I do believe people are innocent until proven guilty, but they've got a lot to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of photo and video evidence here. It's just
it's also
there is no explanation. Go ahead.
Well, the reason we have that video evidence is because one of the corrections officers had a crisis of conscience and released the video. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this video.
Right. One of the women officers secured the video, and I think she recorded it on her phone or something and gave it to the family. And they called her in. The sheriff and his other thugs called her in and dressed her down and confiscated her phone and fired her. So the one person, and of course there were like in the complaint, there are 10 or 12 people listed as the defendants, the people being sued, the sheriff, the public relations officer, several other officers, and 2 medical people, a nurse practitioner and a nurse, and none of them did anything about it. Another thing that happened was when they pulled Tony out and then put him back, if I've got the chronology right, and he had been just living in squalor. There was paper, there was all of this stuff. So they get in there, and while he's still lying there, they start sweeping out the trash and mopping around him as he lies dying. Another thing that the video showed, and I think you may have a picture of this, Keaton, is while he's literally lying on the floor, naked and dying, the officers are laughing.
Yeah, this is what I have here. I'm not sure if this is the exact moment that you're talking about, and forgive the size
Yeah,
here.
it is.
Okay,
I mean,
it
you can
is.
see.
You could see barely like his feet in the corner of the screen, and here they are outside the
Yeah.
room.
I mean, he's
and
there.
then-
He's right there at them. They could reach over and touch him.
Right.
And I believe the woman in red is a nurse, because that looks like a pill cart. At any rate, we had all of these people watching this for 2 weeks. Yeah, he thinks it's funny. And you can see Tony there on the floor. You can see the trash. It's just shocking. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this to your attention is not just because it's an horrific tale of prison abuse, but because I think it reflects on the fact that the narrative about people in death, people who die at the hands of police officers, so much of it has been laid at the foundational cause being racism.
Right.
And I think, of course, racism has its place in our discussion about what's going on. And we talk about having diversity training and getting people mental health training. None of this is going to help. I mean, Tony was white. The sheriff was white. The public relations officer was white. The nurses were white. There were 2 members of the sheriff's, 2 officers who were Black, but I wouldn't presume to put racism as a part of it. I think it's just, and I do want to say, this is off subject, but as part of my story, I learned Friday that the man who was driving and who killed my daughter and her boyfriend, he was undocumented, he was drunk, and all the emphasis in the press, which went everywhere, was about him being undocumented and drunk. Nowhere did they emphasize the fact that there was a high-speed police chase, and he had been headed out of town. And I have tried for 13 years to get people to pay attention to the fact that because she was white doesn't mean she wasn't a victim of the police. Well, I found out Friday he died in custody, not in Walker County, but in Elmore County. So that's now three people who have died in Alabama jails in under a month. The problem, as I see it, is the police themselves. I don't think any sort of diversity training. And Felix Ortega was scheduled to get early parole next month with an ankle monitor. And they asked me, what I felt about him getting parole, and basically I didn't think it was up to me to be involved in it, but I said yes. I mean, what further good is served by him staying in prison, especially that he was the one who had been chosen to bear the full brunt of what happened to Tad and Leanna.
Well, that's an amazing thing. I mean, and that gets to the question that I was going to ask you. I didn't know that going into this segment here. But one of the questions that I did want to ask you is, does this have to do with an approach to justice that I kind of laid out a little bit before we went on the air, which is that, as I understand it, and I've always understood sort of politically and practically, the point of incarcerating people is to, yes, serve as a deterrence so that people know that they can't commit crimes, obviously, to serve as containment or to protect the rest of society from a violent person or a person who is a risk to people. Those make sense. I've spoken to prison abolitionists before. I'm not one myself, although I admire where they're coming from and the world they're looking forward to. Absolutely. Yeah. So I take them very seriously. Right. But there seems to be a third form of justice that a lot of people have in their head. And you're obviously a religious person. I'm not. But so that makes me extra curious to get this perspective from you, because there seems to be a third form of justice that a lot of people hold very near and dear to their heart, which is justice as retribution, incarceration as retribution, as vengeance. And does that not lead to an attitude where anything goes? Because I think there's the attitude within these jails and within the legal system more broadly, obviously, as we get into the January 6th thing, our next segment, that once a person crosses a line and acts outside the bounds of the law in a violent or destructive way, that they're fair game. Anything you do to them is fair game. That's clearly the attitude that these people took towards Tony Mitchell. What do you think about that? And what do you think about that as a sort of underlying philosophical cause for a lot of this?
I don't know. When I first heard about this, I compared it to Abu Ghraib. I don't know what happens to people when they get that kind of power over very vulnerable people. Personally, I don't see any value in retribution. I just don't see it. I don't know that comes from having a religious aspect to me. I just see it as, I see what goes on with our police as being intimately related to what we're doing in Ukraine, to Ukraine.
You're right.
To the fact that we have maybe 24,000 migrants who have died at our border because of a federal policy, which nobody has anything to say about. I don't know. I mean, you want to get the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world off the street and keep them off the street.
Sure, of course.
But not even Jeffrey Dahmer deserves to be murdered.
It doesn't matter what a person does.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Well, when I've talked about this a little bit on the show. I've never been to prison, but I've been to jail a lot. And yeah, it's hard to imagine the total loss of autonomy that you experience when you go in there until you experience it. Mm-hmm. You have absolutely no autonomy. If they say go left, you got to go left. If they say go right, you got to go right. That's it. You're a piece of meat. You're an automaton. And if you're in that position, your life is in their hands. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And yes, the way that I heard about this story before you brought it up is predictably, a lot of people who traffic in racial grievance are trying to use this to argue that there's no racial disparity in the justice system. Look, he's a white guy. And okay, I will say that certainly at this particular moment in time, if this story had been about an African American, this would be all you would hear about. Right. There would have been marches. So yes, I can say as somebody who comes out of the white underclass that, police abuse is a fact of life if you are poor, period.
Right.
If you're poor, no matter what race you are. Now, I would argue, based not only on my experience, but on statistics, if you're African American, they feel a little bit freer, or maybe even a lot freer to do whatever they want, right? But if you're poor, they pretty much feel that freedom anyway. I would say they're a little more restrained with a poor white person than a poor black person. I would say that. But I think that I would argue if you want to build a social justice movement, and this extends to my vision of building a working class economic social justice movement where we all work together. It's the same thing with this. Like, you're not really helping yourself by saying, well, cops only do this to African Americans. If you want everyone to get invested, make the point, no, they do this to everybody who isn't rich. They do this to everybody that they don't have to worry that someone in their family is politically connected, because what are the odds of the guy who lives in this trailer having some connection to the governor? Right? I mean, That's and this is true across the board. This is part of why I speak out so much against identity politics.
Right.
It's not that there's not racial disparity. Of course there is. You have to be insane to argue otherwise. But we have to remember that our real enemy uses identity politics to keep us divided so that we don't get together and look at them.
Right.
And another factor, and I know more about ICE and immigration than I do other aspects of our carceral state and so forth. But, and I don't know where things are now because you have to file freedom of information lawsuits. But I do know that all during the Obama years, the federal government had contracts with for-profit prisons to keep 34,000 immigrant detainees in beds each and every day. That's money. That's capitalism. That's neoliberalism.
Sure.
It's and then they also had quotas to deport 400,000 a year, which is how it added up to 3 million deportations under Obama. One of the things that I don't see happening is solidarity. I mean, it's very, very difficult. It was a much easier thing to do in Huntsville to get down to have our lone Confederate statue taken down, which there was only one in Huntsville, and it was behind a holly bush that was over. I mean, it wasn't doing any damage. That was just, everybody was all over that.
Right. Right.
But at the same time, I was trying to call attention to the fact that ICE Madison County, the county I live in, cooperates more with ICE detainer requests, which gets people deported, than any other county in Alabama except for Talladega. And that was a non-starter.
This is my overall vision, and this is my overall political argument that I've made on the show since the beginning. It's all of a piece. It's all of it even goes back to the banking story we were just talking about.
Right.
The left used to be dangerous. The left used to be a threat to power because the left's critique of capitalism was systemic.
Right.
We had a class critique. We had class consciousness on the left. They spent a lot of time pushing academics to the front of the line who focused on identity issues and very dense, jargon-oriented concepts of decolonization that cannot possibly be unifying because they're not even comprehensible to the average person. I mean, if you try to read a lot of these treatises, look, I'm not saying the average person on the subway is going to have a laugh reading the Communist Manifesto, but it's accessible if you're reasonably educated, right?
Yeah.
But this stuff, I mean, even academics can't get through it. It's just, which is part of the point. It's just dense jargon, which really distinguishes a class signal more than it's really aimed at creating any kind of social justice. And when you look at, we talked about this a little on the show the other day because I watched Gandhi on the way back on the plane.
Right.
And you look at the moral leaders we once had, and you look at the hustlers we have today who get paid $20,000 to make a speech about how racism is incurable. Well, I bet you hope it is. I bet you hope it is.
Yes.
Because that's your bread and butter. That's how you're making your money, right?
Yeah.
Right? You're getting all these corporations to give you don't want that gravy train to end. You don't want to tell them, well, if you do this and that, it's going to resolve the problem. You want to tell them, no, it's irresolvable. So we have a so-called left. Let me put it that way before I get shouted down in the chat about they're not the left. We have a so-called left that's been completely co-opted by capitalism. It's been completely manipulated by capitalism. And when we look at these kids that we think are ridiculous, you know what? they're idealistic. They're idealistic like every generation of youth has been, but they have the misfortune to have come up in a time when capitalism has completely taken over the tools of communication. They've taken over the emphasis of social justice activism as they are educated in it through academia. And so
Right.
they
over
are being
universities.
they're being manipulated into directing their honest, decent desire to create a better world into
Right.
channels that are no threat to multinational corporations.